cutting grass in my front yard. Some questions don't have good answers. What is this? We have to do it! Purpose.
Overlord, 2018. This text presents comprehensive analyses and explanations of the entire film, delving into its narrative architecture, character arcs, thematic undercurrents, and cinematic execution. Directed by Julius Avery, Overlord opens with a sequence that is not merely an action set piece, but a thesis statement on chaos, immediately plunging the audience into the visceral terror of a paratrooper drop gone horribly wrong. The film wastes no time establishing its primary aesthetic, which is a claustrophobic immersion into the randomness of war, where a man can be shredded by flak before his feet ever touch French soil. From this maelstrom of anti-aircraft fire and screaming metal, the narrative coheres around a handful of survivors, each defined not by their heroism, but by their immediate, instinctual reactions to pandemonium. The protagonist, Private Boyce, is introduced in a moment of profound stillness within the roaring C-47, his face a mask of contained terror that contrasts sharply with the bravado of the men around him, immediately marking him as the audience's moral surrogate. His defining characteristic is not his marksmanship, but his deep-seated aversion to taking life, a trait that the film will systematically test, deconstruct, and ultimately redefine as a form of strength rather than weakness. The film's sound design during the drop is a masterpiece of auditory horror, mixing the deafening roar of engines with the whistle of wind through a perforated fuselage to create a symphony of imminent death that overwhelms the senses. When the plane is hit, Avery chooses to trap Boyce in a spinning metal coffin, watching his comrades get sucked into the night sky, a visual that renders the abstract statistics of war into a singular, gut-wrenching reality. Upon landing in the murky, water-filled fields of France, the transition from aerial chaos to terrestrial dread is palpable, the silence broken only by the squelch of muddy boots and the distant barking of German shepherds. The first encounter with the enemy is not a grand firefight but a tense, almost silent stalk through the high grass, where death comes not as a blaze of glory but as a sudden, muffled crack from a silenced pistol. It is here we meet Corporal Ford, a man whose proficiency with a garrote wire and a trench knife establishes him as a coldly efficient instrument of war, existing in a completely different moral universe than Boyce. Ford's philosophy, articulated with a chilling pragmatism, is that the mission is the only sacred thing, and any human element, enemy, civilian, or even his own men, is a variable to be managed or eliminated in its service. The discovery of Chloe's village introduces the civilian cost of occupation, transforming the abstract Fortress Europe into a place of ransacked homes, summary executions, and the constant, humiliating threat of sexual violence embodied by the leering SS officers. Mathilde Olivier's Chloe is presented not as a damsel in need of rescue, but as a simmering cauldron of rage and resilience, a woman who hides her fury behind a mask of complacent domesticity while waging a silent war of survival. The attic where the squad hides becomes a pressure cooker of competing philosophies, with Boyce's empathy for the villagers clashing against Ford's cold calculation that their lives are merely obstacles to the strategic objective of blowing up the church tower. The film's narrative logic hinges on a geographical and symbolic inversion. The church, a traditional place of sanctuary and spiritual elevation, has been hollowed out and perverted into a site of literal infernal creation, with its spire used for Nazi radio transmissions and its crypt for unspeakable experiments. The radio-jamming tower, the ostensible objective, is itself a symbol of psychological warfare, a means of severing communication and spreading chaos, which mirrors the Nazi strategy of disorienting their enemies before destroying them. Boyce's accidental plunge into the depths of the church's basement, through a hole in the floor, is a literal descent into the underworld, a classic mythological journey where the hero stumbles upon the hidden truth that changes the stakes of the entire conflict. The laboratory is not just a set, it is a meticulously designed hellscape of clinical horror, its white tiles and surgical lights gleaming with the cold promise of rationalized atrocity, a direct visual quotation of the dehumanizing industrial logic of the Holocaust. The serum itself, a viscous, black, tar-like substance bubbling up from the earth, externalizes the film's central metaphor. That Nazism is a poisonous ideology drawn from a deep, ancient well of hatred and corruption, a pollutant that reanimates the dead husks of humanity into monstrous parodies of strength. The sound the serum makes as it is injected, a wet, visceral squelch, is an act of sonic body horror that primes the audience for the grotesque transformations to come. The reanimated subjects are not traditional zombies. They are a perversion of the Promethean myth, humans stripped of their souls and rebuilt into tireless, painless engines of destruction, a literalization of the fascist fantasy of the perfect soldier who feels no fear and knows no pity. The practical effects used to bring these creatures to life are a celebration of tactile grossness, with twisted limbs, shattered skulls knitting themselves back together, and a constant, unnerving twitching that suggests the body is now a machine running on a corrupted operating system. The headless corpse that keeps moving, its neck a gory stump, is a deliberate homage to the body horror of the thing, emphasizing that the enemy is no longer human, but a biological weapon that refuses to be deactivated. Corporal Ford's interaction with the serum-created monster is a masterclass in tragic irony. He is the ultimate realist, a man who believes in nothing but his own hard-bought experience, yet he is blindsided by the supernatural, his pragmatic violence suddenly rendered obsolete against a creature that can shrug off a headshot. The narrative employs a ticking clock structure that is not just about the D-Day invasion, but about the exponential spread of the serum. The destruction of the lab is not just a military objective, but an apocalyptic necessity, a race to cauterize a wound before it infects the entire world. The subplot involving the young boy Paul, Chloe's brother, is a crucial element of the film's moral calculus. His innocence is the coin the Nazis casually spend, and his transformation into a potential test subject is the point at which Boyce's passive goodness transforms into a furious, righteous action. The scene where the monstrous Sergeant Waffner, now a grotesque hybrid of human arrogance and undead strength, returns to the attic to confront Chloe is the film's most disturbing sequence, blending the horror of sexual predation with the physical impossibility of a reanimated corpse. Waffner's transformation is a step-by-step obliteration of the human face. His injuries are not just wounds but a gradual erasure, his identity dissolving into a singular, monstrous mask, a visual process that mirrors the way Nazi ideology erased individual morality. His demand that Chloe see him as beautiful, in his new form, is a perverse echo of the fascist obsession with a corrupted aesthetic ideal, an attempt to gaslight the victim into accepting her abuser's monstrousness as a form of grace. The film's treatment of violence is deliberately splatter-adjacent, but never merely gratuitous. Each explosion of gore is meant to provoke a visceral, horrified recoil, reminding the audience that the body is a fragile and sacred vessel that the Nazis treat as mere raw material. The contrast between the American soldiers' injuries, which bleed, hurt, and incapacitate, and the undead Nazis' capacity to absorb endless damage creates a dual tension, pitting fragile humanity against a tireless, synthetic abomination. Boyce's final evolution into a man capable of extreme violence is not a moral fall but a moral maturation, a recognition that certain forms of evil cannot be reasoned with, only annihilated with the same ferocity they unleash. The bayonet he uses to finally dispatch Waffner is a weapon with historical weight, a symbol of the intimate, pre-industrial killing of the trenches, and its use in the film's climactic battle suggests that the oldest, most primal forms of violence are sometimes the only answer to an inhuman enemy. The film's climax is an orgy of fire, gunfire, and collapsing masonry, a gutter dammering inside a church that sees the entire edifice of Nazi hubris literally crashing down around them, the church tower crumbling as a final symbolic repudiation of the desecrated sacred space. The moment when Ford, horribly mutated himself, retains just enough of his humanity to detonate the explosives, sacrificing his body to complete the mission, is the film's emotional core, proving that his utilitarian creed had a core of genuine selflessness all along. The final shot of the film, with Boyce and Chloe sitting amidst the rubble as the roar of naval bombardment in the distance signals the beginning of D-Day, is one of profound exhaustion rather than triumph, a weary acknowledgement that their nightmare was just one small, secret battle in a global cataclysm. From a production design standpoint, the film's depiction of the Nazi-occupied village is claustrophobically authentic, a world of damp stone, perpetual shadow, and the omnipresent iconography of the eagle and swastika, a constant visual reminder of the ideological cancer they are fighting. The lighting design within the laboratory is a study in cold, institutional greens and blinding whites, a color palette that communicates sterility as a form of violence, the absence of warmth as a deliberate cruelty. The film's score, composed by Jed Kurzel, blends traditional orchestral tension with industrial, atonal drones, creating a soundscape that bridges the gap between a historical war epic and a modern horror film, never letting the audience settle comfortably into either genre. The decision to cast actors like Wyatt Russell, who carries the ghost of his father Kurt Russell's cinematic legacy in his rugged features, adds a metatextual layer to Ford's character, evoking the archetypal tough guy soldiers of 1980s action cinema while complicating them with a harsh, modern nihilism. Pilou Asbæk's performance as Waffner is a study in reptilian charm curdling into monstrous rage. He plays the character not as a cartoonish villain, but as a smug, entitled predator whose unearned confidence becomes literally monstrous. The film's dedication to practical gore over computer-generated imagery grounds the fantastical elements in a tangible, physical reality, making the mutant soldiers feel like they occupy real space and pose a genuine physical threat, rather than being weightless pixels. The geography of the final battle, which sees characters crawling through the church's organ pipes, leaping from balconies, and fighting in the bell tower, uses the verticality of the setting to create a multi-level arena of chaos that keeps the action clear and thrillingly inventive. The moment when Boyce finds the recorded voice of a victim begging for death, a looped audio track of pure agony, is a chilling reminder that the horror of the experiments is not just physical but psychological, the imposition of unending suffering. The racial dynamics of the film, while not the central focus, are subtly integrated into Boyce's character, whose quiet competence and moral clarity in the face of a white supremacist enemy carries an unmistakable historical resonance, contrasting the Nazis' hollow ideology of racial purity with Boyce's genuine heroism. Overlord's unique structure, which commits entirely to the war genre for its first act before pulling the rug out from under the audience, works because it establishes genuine affection for the characters as soldiers before asking us to care about them as horror movie survivors. The film is essentially a dungeon crawl in cinematic form, with the squad descending from the forest, into the village, into the attic, and finally into the crypt and the lab, each new environment more dangerous and distorted than the last. The dialogue is functional and occasionally poetic in its bluntness. Ford's command to kick the tires and light the fires is less a rousing speech than a ritual incantation, a way of firing up his men's courage through sheer, gruff certainty. The film's use of the D-Day backdrop is not a cynical co-opting of historical tragedy, but a reverent framing device. The courage of the real paratroopers who jumped into the darkness of occupied France is the foundation upon which the supernatural mayhem is built, a tribute to their willingness to face unimaginable horror. The secret Nazi science trope is a long-standing tradition in exploitation cinema. From shock documentaries to grindhouse features, and Overlord knowingly situates itself within this lineage, polishing the pulp conventions with blockbuster-level craft. The medical implements in the lab, the oversized syringes, the trepanation drills, the leather restraints, are fetishistically detailed, their gleaming surfaces promising pain, a tactile museum of torture that implicates the audience's morbid curiosity. The serum's origin, bubbling up from a subterranean pit, suggests an almost Lovecraftian dimension to the horror, a hint that the Nazis were not just scientists but dark alchemists, tapping into an ancient, chthonic evil that predates humanity itself. This Lovecraftian element remains a mysterious, unelaborated background detail, a deliberate creative choice that deepens the horror by refusing to explain it, leaving the audience with the unsettling sense that the true source of the corruption is fundamentally unknowable. The relationship between Boyce and Chloe is built on acts of mutual rescue, a transactional heroism that transcends language barriers and romantic cliché, grounding their bond in the pragmatic solidarity of two people trying to survive a hellscape. The death of the squad's translator early in the film is a practical nightmare that forces characters to communicate through gesture, tone, and the universal language of a pointed gun, adding a layer of desperate miscommunication to every encounter. The film's pacing is relentless, a 90-minute siege of the nervous system that barely pauses for breath, yet it finds moments of quiet character work, such as the squad's banter about Ford's mysterious past, that invest us in their fates. The gore effects for the half-transformed Waffner, with his exposed ribcage pulsing and his face a shattered mask of exposed muscle, represent the apotheosis of the film's body horror, the point at which the human form finally collapses into a walking wound. The visual effects team cleverly used a mix of prosthetics and subtle digital enhancements to make Waffner's body move in ways that are physically impossible for a normal human, creating an uncanny valley effect that triggers a deep, primal revulsion. The church organ, which is played at one point to create a thunderous, dissonant soundtrack of madness, becomes an instrument of war itself, its pipes becoming a hiding place and a conduit for bullets, a literalization of the phrase, organ of destruction. The film's commentary on the perversion of medical ethics is sharp and unflinching. The Nazi doctor, a minor but chilling figure, embodies the banality of evil, treating the screams of his victims as mere data points in a grand scientific project. The green smoke that sometimes accompanies the reanimation process is a visual motif that transforms the victims into something alien, a poisonous miasma that visually separates them from the realm of the living, marking them as creatures of a toxic, alternative biology. The brief respite in the film, when the squad shares a quiet meal with Chloe and Paul, is a deliberate oasis of humanity that makes the subsequent horrors all the more jarring, a glimpse of the world they are fighting to preserve. The tactical discussions among the soldiers, debating angles of attack and the location of explosives, are rendered with enough technical verisimilitude to ground the film's more outlandish plot turns in a recognizable reality of military procedure. The film's use of the French language, often unsubtitled in moments of heightened tension, immerses the audience in the same disorientation the American soldiers feel, making us strain to understand, to read faces and tones for signs of danger. The recurring motif of the radio, with its static hiss and its potential to summon the aerial and naval might of the Allied invasion, becomes a symbol of hope that is perpetually out of reach, a grail that drives the action forward. The moment when a reanimated soldier literally catches a grenade and holds it, his hand exploding but his body continuing to advance, is a sublime piece of action horror choreography that encapsulates the entire film's thesis. The enemy is not just resilient. He is a mockery of the very concept of defeat. The film's color grading shifts subtly from the desaturated, muddy browns and greens of the war sequences to the lurid, sickly yellows and greens of the lab, a visual cue that we have crossed from the historical world into a realm of pulp nightmare. The architecture of the church, with its Gothic arches and looming statuary, provides a constant visual irony. The saints and martyrs depicted in stone look down upon a new kind of martyrdom, a scientific sacrifice performed on an altar of stainless steel. The actor John Magaro, as the hapless and doomed Tibbet, provides a crucial grounding in the random cruelty of war. His jokes and his quiet terror are brutally and abruptly extinguished, reminding us that death in war is not always heroic, often being just a sudden, meaningless full stop. The sound mixing during the reanimation sequences layers wet, organic sounds. The snap of bones, the squish of regenerating flesh, over the labored breathing of the horrified witnesses, putting the audience inside their revulsion. The film's understanding of strategy is sound. The Allies' need to destroy the jamming tower is not just a plot device, but a reflection of the critical importance of radio communication in coordinating the Normandy landings, a historical fact that lends gravity to the fictional horror. The final confrontation between Boyce and Waffner is a battle of ideologies fought with fists, knives, and sheer, stubborn will, stripping away the technological trappings of war to reveal the primitive, animal struggle at its heart. When Boyce injects Waffner with the remaining serum, causing him to monstrously overinflate and deform before being blown apart, it is a poetic act of justice, using the poison of Nazism as the instrument of its own destruction. The film's credit sequence, simple white text on a black screen accompanied by a somber, echoing score, is a respectful silence after the cacophony, a moment to reflect on the madness that has just concluded. The depiction of the German soldiers who are not SS is subtly differentiated. They are portrayed as conventional combatants, also trapped in the machinery of war, which makes the specific evil of the SS experimenters stand out in sharper relief. The film's marketing, which leaned heavily into the "From the Mind of J.J. Abrams" tag, initially disguised the true nature of the horror, making the sudden descent into mad science a genuine shock for audiences expecting a straightforward war movie, a narrative ambush that mirrors the soldiers' own discovery. The catacombs beneath the church, with their piles of bones and ancient carved tunnels, connect the 20th century horror of Nazism to a deeper, medieval darkness, suggesting that the impulse to desecrate and dominate is an ancient, recurring human sickness. The film's approach to heroism is fundamentally democratic. A pacifist, a gruff sergeant, a French civilian, and a handful of scared soldiers all contribute essential pieces to the victory, arguing that the defeat of great evil requires a coalition of diverse forms of courage. The practical effect of the exploding head, a signature moment in the film, is achieved with such a visceral mess of fluid and matter that it momentarily transforms the screen into a Jackson Pollock painting of gore, a fleeting, shocking image that burns into the retina. The screenplay's structure is elegantly simple: a mission, a complication, a revelation, a siege, an escape. This classic architecture allows the film to indulge in its wildest excesses without ever losing its narrative coherence. The film's title, Overlord, is borrowed directly from the historical codename for the Battle of Normandy, a choice that instantly anchors the fantastical narrative in one of the most consequential military operations in human history, lending it an unearned but effective gravitas. The quiet moments of trauma, such as Boyce's trembling hands after his first kill, are essential counterweights to the gleeful violence, ensuring that the film never fully becomes the thoughtless action cartoon it sometimes resembles. The use of shadow in the laboratory, with figures moving in and out of pools of sickly light, creates a constant sense of unseen threats lurking just beyond the frame, a classic horror technique executed with technical perfection. The character of Ford is haunted by a past that is hinted at but never fully explained, a narrative reticence that makes him more, not less, compelling. His death is a kind of release from a lifetime of unspoken pain. The film's environmental storytelling, such as the bullet-riddled walls of the village or the overturned furniture in the church, speaks eloquently of the violence that has already occurred before our protagonists even arrived, building a world that feels lived in and dying. The reanimated rats in the lab are a small but brilliantly sickening detail, a hint that the serum's corruption is not limited to humans, threatening to unleash a pestilential, unstoppable ecosystem of horror. The final line of dialogue is not a triumphant one-liner, but a weary, almost whispered acknowledgement of survival, a fitting conclusion for a film that, beneath its grindhouse thrills, maintains a somber respect for the sheer exhaustion of combat. The film stands as a testament to the potential of genre hybridity, proving that the raw materials of history can be alchemically combined with the tropes of fantasy to create something that is both disrespectfully entertaining and strangely, deeply reverent of the courage it depicts. The ultimate implication of the film's final frame, as the Allies arrive to a scene of inexplicable carnage, is that the true story of the war contains horrors that official history has never, and will never fully acknowledge, a secret war fought in the shadows of a global one. The film's opening sequence functions as a brutal birth trauma, ripping soldiers from the womb-like safety of the aircraft and thrusting them violently into a hostile world where gravity itself becomes a weapon against them. The paratroopers' descent through the night sky, illuminated by tracer fire and exploding flak, transforms the romantic image of airborne warfare into a spectacle of absolute vulnerability. Men dangling helplessly beneath silk canopies while death reaches up from the ground to claim them. The sound of wind screaming past Boyce's ears as he plummets, mixed with the distant concussions of anti-aircraft shells, creates an auditory hallucination of the moment between life and death, a liminal space where time seems to stretch into an eternity of freefall. The film's commitment to showing the mechanical brutality of the drop, including the gruesome detail of a man being cut in half by a plane's wing, establishes an unflinching contract with the audience that this story will not sanitize the physical reality of violence. The waterlogged fields where the survivors land become a primordial swamp, a return to a formless, drowning world where soldiers must literally crawl out of the muck to be reborn as the warriors the mission requires them to become. The cinematography during the regrouping sequence employs a desaturated, almost monochromatic palette that drains the French countryside of its pastoral beauty, rendering it an alien moonscape of hedgerows and shadows where every bush might conceal a German bayonet. The film's use of handheld camera work creates a documentary immediacy that recalls combat footage, the frame trembling and lurching as if the camera operator himself is running for his life alongside the soldiers. The decision to light the early scenes almost entirely with moonlight and distant fires transforms the familiar terrain of rural France into a chiaroscuro nightmare, a world stripped of color and comfort where men are reduced to silhouettes stalking other silhouettes. The first kill that Boyce witnesses up close, performed by Ford with the casual efficiency of a butcher dressing game, shatters the private's remaining illusions about the nobility of warfare and replaces them with the cold recognition that survival requires the suspension of moral delicacy. The squelching sound of the trench knife entering a German sentry's throat, mixed with the man's choked gurgle, is engineered to bypass the audience's intellectual defenses and lodge directly in the gut, a moment of pure, unmediated visceral horror that sets the tone for everything that follows. The village that the squad infiltrates is not merely a set but a character in its own right, its cobblestone streets and shuttered windows radiating a palpable atmosphere of fear that has calcified into the very stonework over 4 years of occupation. The production design team populated this environment with telling details. A child's abandoned toy lying in the gutter, a smear of old blood on a whitewashed wall, the faded photograph of a family still hanging crookedly in a ransacked home, each object a silent testament to interrupted lives and vanished people. The contrast between the warm, golden light spilling from Chloe's kitchen window and the cold, blue darkness of the occupied streets creates a visual dialectic between sanctuary and threat, civilization and its collapse. Chloe's home becomes a temporary refuge, but the film never allows the audience to forget that this safety is an illusion, a fragile bubble maintained only through constant vigilance and the willingness to lie to the faces of the occupiers. The presence of Paul, her young brother, raises the stakes beyond military objectives, introducing the vulnerability of innocent life into a calculus that Ford would prefer to keep purely strategic and emotionally unencumbered. The attic where the soldiers hide is a transitional space between the human world below and the divine space above, a limbo where plans are made and tensions simmer, its sloping ceilings and cramped dimensions forcing the characters into an uncomfortable physical and psychological proximity. It is within this confined space that the philosophical conflict between Boyce and Ford crystallizes, their whispered arguments becoming a debate about the nature of duty, the value of individual lives versus strategic objectives, and the question of what exactly they are fighting to preserve. Ford's worldview represents a kind of moral utilitarianism taken to its darkest extreme, a philosophy forged in the crucible of previous campaigns where sentimentality, he has learned through bitter experience, gets men killed. Boyce's resistance to this cold logic is not naive idealism, but a stubborn insistence that the means must justify the ends, that becoming like the enemy in order to defeat the enemy is its own form of defeat. The physical descent into the church's basement, accomplished when the floorboards give way beneath Boyce's feet, is shot as a dizzying plummet into darkness, the camera tumbling with him, as if falling into a nightmare from which there will be no waking. The catacombs beneath the church represent a vertical axis of evil, a shaft dug deep into the earth that connects the horrors of the present to the accumulated darkness of centuries, its walls lined with the bones of the long dead who now bear silent witness to fresh atrocities. The production design of the catacombs draws on centuries of Gothic tradition, with their low, arched ceilings, their niches filled with skulls, and their pervasive dampness that seems to seep into the bones of both characters and audience alike. The discovery of the black, bubbling pit of serum at the deepest point of the catacombs introduces an almost geological dimension to the horror, suggesting that the evil the Nazis have tapped is not something they invented, but something they excavated, an ancient corruption that has been waiting beneath the surface of the world for millennia. The visual effect of the serum, its iridescent surface shimmering with an oily malevolence, communicates its unnaturalness through purely visual means, a liquid that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, a substance of pure negation. The laboratory, when Boyce finally stumbles into it, is presented as a temple of reason perverted to the service of madness, its gleaming equipment and meticulously organized surgical tools representing the aesthetic of scientific progress hollowed out and filled with the content of pure sadism. The overhead surgical lights cast a harsh, shadowless illumination that erases all nuance and ambiguity, creating a visual field of absolute clinical exposure where nothing can hide from the inquiring gaze of the torturer scientist. The bodies strapped to gurneys, some still twitching, some horrifyingly still, are arranged with the meticulous precision of a museum exhibit, the Nazi doctor having transformed human suffering into a taxonomy of pain to be catalogued and studied. The tape recordings that Boyce discovers, the voices of victims begging for death in calm, recorded loops, represent the bureaucratization of evil, the reduction of human agony to data points in a research project. The film here engages with the legacy of the real-world Nazi medical experiments, translating the historical horror of non-consensual human experimentation into the visceral language of body horror, making the abstract statistics of atrocity into a single, screaming, immediate reality. The reanimation process, when Boyce witnesses it for the first time, is a perverse resurrection, a mockery of both medical science and religious miracle that results not in healing, but in the creation of a being trapped between life and death, a consciousness extinguished and replaced with pure, directionless aggression. The practical effects used to depict the reanimated corpses are a triumph of prosthetic artistry, the actors' bodies transformed into landscapes of surgical trauma. Stitches pulling apart, skin sloughing away, bones visible through rents in decaying flesh. The movement language developed for the reanimated soldiers is distinct from the shambling of traditional cinematic zombies, instead employing a twitchy, spasmodic physicality that suggests a nervous system firing randomly, a body hijacked by an alien intelligence that has not yet learned to operate its stolen vehicle. The sound that accompanies the reanimated, a combination of wet, rattling breaths and a low, guttural moan that seems to originate from somewhere deeper than the lungs, creates an acoustic signature of profound wrongness, a noise that no living throat should be capable of producing. The confrontation between the reanimated soldier and Ford in the laboratory is a pivotal moment of genre collision. The hardened realism of the war film suddenly forced to grapple with the impossible, a dead man rising to continue a fight that should have ended with a bullet to the brain. Ford's reaction, a split second of stunned incomprehension followed by a rapid recalibration to the new rules of engagement, is a masterclass in conveying character through action rather than dialogue, the sergeant immediately adapting his tactics to target the head after seeing center-mass shots prove ineffective. This moment of adaptation is the film's structural hinge, the point at which the war movie and the horror movie cease to be separate genres coexisting in the same narrative and instead fuse into a third thing, a hybrid form that follows the logic of both while being reducible to neither. The decision to have the characters name what they are facing, to explicitly invoke the vocabulary of horror cinema by calling the creatures monsters rather than maintaining the pretense of scientific explanation, is a knowing wink to the audience that also serves the narrative by showing the soldiers' minds struggling to categorize the uncategorizable. Waffner's character arc, from arrogant SS officer preening in his uniform to grotesque abomination begging for validation from the woman he terrorized, traces a trajectory of moral and physical decay that functions as the film's most explicit political allegory. His initial presentation leans heavily on the cinematic archetype of the charming Nazi sociopath, a man whose polished manners and handsome features barely conceal the void where his conscience should be, his flirtatious cruelty toward Chloe suggesting appetites that will not be satisfied by mere conquest. His decision to inject himself with the serum is an act of hubris that the classical dramatists would have recognized immediately. The tragic flaw of overwhelming pride leading the powerful man to reach for godhood and instead find monstrosity. The progressive stages of Wafner's transformation are charted with a meticulous attention to the gradual erosion of his human features, his face becoming a palimpsest of injuries over which new flesh grows wrong, twisted, and asymmetrical, a physical manifestation of his inner corruption made visible. His return to Chloe after his transformation, his demand that she look at him and see not a monster but a superior being, is a scene of profound psychological horror that understands the rapist's psychology as fundamentally delusional, an inability to comprehend the victim's reality that persists even after the perpetrator has become literally inhuman. The rape-revenge undertones of Chloe's eventual retaliation against Wafner, the victim finally turning on her tormentor with a fury that has been banked and building for years, gives the film's finale a cathartic charge that transcends the simple dispatching of a monster. When she drives her weapon into his body, the act is not merely self-defense, but a reclamation of agency, a refusal to be defined by the abuse she has suffered, and a violent assertion of her own personhood in the face of an ideology that denies her humanity. The film is careful not to sexualize this violence, instead framing it as a necessary and righteous destruction, an exorcism of the predator that has haunted her home and her life. The collaboration between Chloe and Boyce in this final sequence, their movements coordinated without the need for verbal communication, demonstrates the depth of the bond they have forged in the crucible of shared trauma, a partnership based not on romance, but on mutual recognition of each other's full humanity. The character of Tibbet, the squad's joker and designated cynic, functions as a barometer of the group's morale, his wisecracks becoming progressively more hollow and desperate as the situation deteriorates until they finally cease altogether, replaced by a wide-eyed silence that communicates more terror than any scream. His death, sudden and brutal and entirely without ceremony, is a reminder that the war film genre's conventions of heroic last stands and meaningful sacrifices are themselves a kind of comforting fiction, a narrative structure imposed on a reality of meaningless, random extinction. The other squad members, delineated with quick but effective strokes of characterization, represent the cross-section of American society drafted into the war. The farm boy, the city tough, the quiet professional, each bringing their own regional accent and cultural assumptions into the melting pot of the unit. The film's treatment of these secondary characters is economical rather than dismissive, their deaths given just enough weight to register as losses without derailing the narrative momentum. A balancing act that respects the character's humanity while acknowledging the harsh economy of screen time in a tightly paced horror-action hybrid. The film's color palette undergoes a subtle but significant shift as the narrative progresses from war movie to horror movie. The initial desaturated blues and greens gradually infiltrated by warmer but sicklier tones, yellows and oranges that suggest infection and decay rather than comfort. This chromatic evolution mirrors the thematic movement from the cold, mechanical violence of conventional warfare to the hot, organic horror of the serum's corrupting influence, two different registers of destruction distinguished by their visual temperatures. The lighting design within the church becomes increasingly expressionistic as the film approaches its climax, shadows lengthening and deepening, the flickering illumination from fires and explosions creating a strobe effect that fragments action into a series of freeze frames, a technique borrowed from the climax of Apocalypse now that renders violence as a series of disconnected, nightmarish tableaus. The bell tower, the film's vertical endpoint, represents the last refuge of the sacred in a building that has been systematically desecrated, its bell a dormant voice that might, if rung, still speak of something transcendent beyond the bloodshed unfolding below. The thematic exploration of voice and its suppression runs throughout the film, from the jamming tower that chokes off communication to the screams of victims recorded on endless loops to the literal voicelessness of the reanimated, who can moan and roar but cannot speak, their humanity stripped away along with their capacity for language. This concern with voice and silence connects to the historical reality of occupation, where the occupied are forced into a condition of enforced voicelessness, their opinions and desires rendered irrelevant by the brute fact of armed authority. The film's climax, which sees the destruction of the jamming tower, is thus also a liberation of voice, a restoration of the ability to communicate, to call for help, to coordinate rescue, the static of authoritarian suppression finally clearing to allow the signal of liberation to come through. The naval bombardment that begins in the film's final moments, The thunder of offshore battleships that signals the commencement of D-Day is the ultimate voice of liberation, a sound so immense it shakes the very ground. The Allied nations finally speaking in a language that even the most fanatical Nazi cannot ignore. The serum's mechanism of action, killing the host before reanimating it, establishes a symbolic logic in which the Nazi pursuit of power requires a preliminary suicide, an annihilation of the human self as a prerequisite for the acquisition of inhuman strength. This logic maps onto the broader historical understanding of fascism as a political movement that requires its adherents to surrender their individual moral autonomy to the collective will embodied by the leader, a kind of psychological death that precedes and enables the commission of atrocities. The reanimated soldiers, stripped of memory, empathy, and individual will, are the literal embodiment of the fascist ideal of the citizen soldier, a being that has been purified of all those troublesome human qualities that might impede its function as an instrument of state violence. The film's argument, implicit in its depiction of these creatures as horrifying monstrosities, is that the fascist project of transcending human limitation is not a path to superhumanity, but to subhumanity, a regression to a state of pure, animalistic aggression that represents not the fulfillment of human potential, but its absolute negation. The relationship between the film's Catholic imagery and its Protestant protagonists creates a rich field of symbolic tension. The American soldiers moving through a sacred space whose specific theological grammar they do not fully understand, but whose desecration they instinctively recognize as evil. The Church's statuary, its crucifixes and saints and martyrs, look down upon the action with the mute reproach of witnesses who have seen this before, who recognize in the Nazis' atrocities an ancient pattern of human cruelty reaching back to the Roman persecutions. The explosion that destroys the church at the film's climax can be read as either a final act of desecration, the complete annihilation of a sacred space that has been irredeemably contaminated, or as a purification by fire, a cleansing of the pollution that has been festering in its crypt. The film wisely refuses to adjudicate between these interpretations, leaving the symbolic resonance of the destruction ambiguous, a question mark rather than a period at the end of the film's engagement with religious imagery. The film's pacing employs a ratcheting structure of tension and release, each action sequence building to a peak of intensity before subsiding into a brief valley of relative calm where characters can take stock, mourn their losses, and plan their next moves. This rhythm, borrowed from the classic war film tradition, prevents the audience from becoming numb to the violence by providing regular opportunities for emotional recalibration, moments where the human cost of the action can be registered before the next onslaught begins. The editing during the action sequences is fast but never incoherent, maintaining a clear spatial logic that allows the audience to track the positions and movements of characters through the chaos, a discipline that many modern action films have abandoned in favor of a disorienting barrage of images that prioritizes sensation over comprehension. The geography of the church, established carefully in the early scenes of reconnaissance and exploration, pays dividends in the final act as characters navigate its multiple levels, rooms, and secret passages with a spatial confidence that makes the action legible and therefore thrilling rather than merely confusing. The film's handling of the German language is a subtle but significant element of its immersive strategy, with German characters speaking their native tongue in unsubtitled exchanges that exclude the audience from their communications, aligning us with the American protagonists who also cannot understand what is being said. This technique generates a low-level anxiety that hums beneath the surface of every interaction with the occupiers, the sense that decisions affecting life and death are being made in a linguistic register we cannot access. When characters do translate for each other, the act of translation becomes a node of power, the translator positioned as a gatekeeper of meaning whose interpretations can shape actions and outcomes. The multilingual texture of the film, with French, German, and English weaving in and out of each other, reflects the historical reality of the Western European theater as a collision of languages and cultures forced into violent proximity. The film's debt to the tradition of the men-on-a-mission war film, from The Dirty Dozen to Where Eagles Dare, is acknowledged and honored even as it is subverted by the introduction of supernatural elements that those earlier films would have considered beneath their dignity. The structure of the mission, the assembly of a team with complementary skills, the infiltration of an enemy stronghold, the planting of explosives, and the race to escape before detonation, all hew closely to the template established by the classic war films of the post-war decades. What Overlord adds to this formula is a recognition that the enemy's evil might extend beyond conventional military aggression into realms of supernatural or pseudoscientific horror, a pulp sensibility that the classic films, bound by the constraints of realist respectability, could only hint at. The film thus functions as both homage and corrective, a film that loves the war movie tradition enough to want to push it into territories its originators never imagined. The casting of Jovan Adepo as Boyce brings a quality of interiority to the role that transcends the often limited emotional range demanded by action horror protagonists, his expressive face communicating the moral calculations constantly running behind his eyes. His scenes with Wyatt Russell's Ford are constructed as duets of contrasting performance styles, Adepo's naturalistic emotional transparency playing against Russell's opaque, tightly wound minimalism. Two different theories of how a man confronts extreme pressure embodied in two different acting traditions. Russell, carrying the weight of his father Kurt's iconic screen persona into a role that knowingly references and complicates that legacy, delivers a performance that is all the more affecting for its refusal to seek audience sympathy. A portrayal of a man who has made peace with his own emotional deadness and asks only that his competence be acknowledged. The chemistry between these two actors creates a relationship that is neither friendship nor antagonism, but something more complex. A mutual respect earned through shared danger that coexists with a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the enterprise they are engaged in. The film's soundscape is a character in its own right, a carefully constructed environment of noise and silence that does as much to shape the audience's emotional experience as any visual element. The distant thunder of naval bombardment that bookends the film connects the small-scale horror of the village to the vast historical event of the invasion, a reminder that the character's ordeal is a microcosm of a global cataclysm. The organic sounds of the reanimation process, the wet tearing of tissue and the grinding of bones resetting themselves, are engineered to trigger a visceral disgust response that bypasses cognitive processing, a direct line to the lizard brain's aversion to the smells and sounds of decay. The film's score, when it asserts itself, does so strategically, filling the silences between these diegetic horrors with a carpet of dread that sustains the tension even when nothing overtly threatening is occurring on screen. The film's engagement with the body horror tradition, particularly the work of David Cronenberg, is evident in its fascination with the interior of the human form, its willingness to show us what lies beneath the skin and to render that revelation as a source of profound unease. The surgical sequences, with their gleaming retractors and probing instruments, invade the body's sanctity in ways that the gunplay of the war sequences, for all its violence, does not, the intimacy of the violation generating a qualitatively different order of horror. The body in Overlord is not a fortress to be defended but a territory to be mapped, invaded, and transformed by an occupying power, an experience of violation that the film implicitly connects to the broader experience of military occupation represented by the Nazi presence in the village. The parallel between the surgical invasion of individual bodies and the military invasion of the body politic is left for the audience to discover, an interpretive possibility that enriches the film without being didactically asserted. The film's final shot, of Boyce and Chloe sitting in exhausted silence as the dawn of D-Day breaks over the smoking ruins of the church, is a study in aftermath, a refusal to provide the conventional satisfactions of triumphant closure. Their faces, streaked with grime and blood, register neither joy nor relief, but simply the blankness of survival, the thousand-yard stare of people who have seen things that language cannot adequately convey. The roar of the naval guns and the drone of approaching aircraft promise that the larger battle is about to begin, that their private war against the monsters in the church was merely the prelude to the main event, a sobering perspective that keeps the film's triumphalism in check. The quietness of this ending, its retreat from spectacle into reflection, is a mark of the film's underlying seriousness, its recognition that the experience of combat does not culminate in catharsis, but in a silence that contains multitudes of unprocessed trauma. The film's treatment of the natural environment as a silent participant in the horror deserves sustained attention. The French countryside itself seeming to recoil from the occupation, its fields lying fallow and its forests holding their breath as if the land itself were waiting for liberation. The mud that cakes the soldiers' uniforms is not merely a cosmetic detail, but a tactile reminder of the Earth's indifference to human conflicts, a primordial substance that will eventually reclaim all the combatants regardless of their ideological allegiances. The hedgerows of Normandy, which historically provided cover for German defenders and became killing grounds of notorious ferocity, are rendered in the film as organic architecture, living walls that channel movement and conceal threats with the impassive neutrality of nature. The water that appears throughout the film, from the flooded fields of the opening to the dripping walls of the catacombs to the vials of serum that shimmer with aqueous malevolence, functions as a unifying element, a substance that gives life and takes it away with equal indifference, a medium through which corruption travels and transforms. The film's handling of time is more sophisticated than its B-movie surface might suggest, employing a compressed chronology that traps characters and audience alike in a perpetual present tense of immediate threat, the past accessible only through fragmentary memories, and the future unimaginable beyond the next few minutes of survival. This temporal claustrophobia is a deliberate aesthetic strategy that replicates the psychological experience of combat, where soldiers report that time itself seems to warp, moments of extreme danger stretching into eternities while hours of waiting collapse into instants. The ticking clock of the D-Day invasion, constantly referenced but never directly shown until the final frames, exerts a gravitational pull on the narrative, its inexorable approach lending urgency to every decision and consequence to every delay. The film's relationship to historical time is complex, treating the events of June 5 to 6, 1944, not as a fixed historical record to be faithfully reproduced, but as an imaginative playground where the factual and the fantastical can coexist without mutual cancellation. A space where what actually happened and what might have happened in some darker timeline overlap and interpenetrate. The architecture of the Nazi occupation, as depicted in the film, extends beyond the physical structures of the church and the laboratory into a comprehensive system of surveillance and control that anticipates the totalitarian dystopias of later cinematic imagination. The constant patrols, the identity papers demanded at gunpoint, the public executions designed to terrorize the population into compliance, all these elements create a texture of pervasive oppression that the film renders with documentary precision before introducing its supernatural elements. The German shepherds that accompany the patrols, their snarling muzzles and straining leashes, embody a particularly visceral form of threat, the animal kingdom pressed into the service of fascism, instinct weaponized and directed against the innocent. The radio equipment that fills the church, its blinking lights and humming vacuum tubes, represents the technological dimension of occupation, the Nazi war machine's dependence on communication and coordination that the Allied mission seeks to sever at its source. The film's understanding of the relationship between science and ideology is nuanced in ways that elevate it above typical mad scientist narratives, recognizing that the Nazi experiments are not a deviation from rational scientific method, but a horrifyingly logical extension of a worldview that has already classified certain humans as subhuman and therefore eligible for instrumentalization. The laboratory equipment, the centrifuges and microscopes and refrigeration units, are not props suggesting mad science, but representations of genuine scientific infrastructure. The same tools that in other contexts produce vaccines and antibiotics here producing only suffering and death. The Nazi doctor, though a minor character in terms of screen time, embodies the principle that Hannah Arendt identified as the banality of evil, a functionary in a white coat who has substituted professional ambition for moral reasoning, and who regards his screaming subjects with the detached curiosity of an entomologist studying pinned insects. His absence of overt sadism is in some ways more disturbing than cartoonish villainy would be, suggesting a mind that has so thoroughly compartmentalized its empathy that cruelty has become simply another category of technical problem to be solved through methodological persistence. The serum's color, that iridescent black that seems to contain depths within depths, suggests oil as much as it suggests tar, linking the Nazi super-soldier project to the petroleum-fueled machinery of modern warfare, as if the substance were the concentrated essence of the industrial age's capacity for destruction rendered into injectable form. The fact that the serum emerges from beneath the earth, from a geological stratum that predates human civilization, introduces a temporal vertigo into the film's cosmology, suggesting that the evil the Nazis have tapped is not a product of their particular historical moment, but a permanent potentiality of the planet itself, an ancient darkness waiting for human ambition to provide it with vessels. This quasi-Lovecraftian element, the intimation of horrors that precede and will survive humanity, adds a cosmic dimension to what might otherwise be a contained historical horror. opening the film's imaginative horizons onto abysses of time that dwarf the human conflicts playing out on the surface. The relationship between the American soldiers and the French villagers is marked by a mutual wariness that the film refuses to sentimentalize, acknowledging the historical reality that the liberated and their liberators often regarded each other with suspicion born of cultural difference, language barriers, and the asymmetrical power dynamics of occupation and rescue. Chloe's initial distrust of the Americans, her demand that they prove their identities and intentions before she will offer aid, reflects the survival strategies developed over years of occupation, where trust could be fatal and every stranger might be a collaborator or a trap. The slow process by which this distrust is eroded, replaced by the grudging respect of people who have demonstrated their reliability through actions rather than words, is one of the film's most carefully observed emotional arcs, a relationship that develops through shared danger rather than through dialogue or romantic convention. The Americans, for their part, bring their own cultural baggage into the encounter, their assumptions about France and the French colored by the exoticizing lens of men who have never left their own country before being deposited into this one by parachute and gunfire. The film's treatment of disability and bodily difference is complex and potentially troubling. The reanimated soldiers representing a kind of hypertrophied physical capability that is simultaneously superhuman and profoundly disabled, bodies that have been stripped of the vulnerabilities that make human life recognizable as human. The twitching, spasming movements of the reanimated, their apparent inability to control their own musculature, suggest neurological damage of the most profound kind, consciousness trapped inside bodies that no longer respond to its commands in any coherent way. This representation can be read as exploiting the visual language of disability for horror effects, a common and often criticized trope in horror cinema, but it can also be read as a critique of the fascist contempt for bodily vulnerability. The Nazi project of eliminating weakness resulting not in the transcendence of limitation, but in a grotesque caricature of strength that is in fact a form of profound debilitation. The film walks a fine line here, and different viewers will adjudicate its success in navigating this ethical terrain differently. The weaponry depicted in the film is handled with the fetishistic precision that war movie audiences have come to expect, each firearm specified with historical accuracy and employed with tactical plausibility, the Thompson submachine guns and M1 Garands and MP40s all behaving as their real-world counterparts would behave. This attention to period-appropriate armament grounds the fantastic elements in a matrix of verifiable detail, the authentic kick of a period rifle serving as an anchor of realism in a narrative that increasingly departs from realistic premises. The sound of each weapon is distinct and recognizable, the sharp crack of the M1 Garand contrasting with the stuttering chatter of the German machine pistols, creating an auditory landscape that knowledgeable viewers can navigate with their eyes closed. The film's sound designers have clearly done their homework, recording period weapons or their modern reproductions to capture the specific acoustic signatures that would have echoed through the Norman countryside in June of 1944. The film's approach to its female characters, while limited by the constraints of the men-on-a-mission genre, makes genuine efforts to invest Chloe with agency and complexity that exceed the typical requirements of the war movie love interest. Her backstory, communicated economically through a few lines of dialogue and Mathilde Olivier's haunted performance, sketches a history of loss and resistance that has steeled her into the formidable survivor we meet, a woman who has already endured the worst the occupation can inflict and has emerged not broken but hardened into a weapon of her own. Her medical skills, demonstrated when she tends to the wounded soldiers, establish her competence in a domain that the film codes as valuable, her knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology proving as essential to the mission's success as the soldier's knowledge of explosives and tactics. The moment when she takes up a rifle and joins the fight is not presented as a surprising departure from her established character, but as the logical culmination of her trajectory, the final step in a transformation from victim to combatant that has been underway since long before the Americans arrived. The film's climactic set piece, the multi-level battle through the church as the timer counts down to detonation, is a marvel of spatial choreography that keeps multiple characters engaged in simultaneous action across different elevations and rooms, cutting between them with a rhythm that maintains clarity while building intensity. The geography established in earlier scenes pays off here, as characters use their knowledge of the church's layout to outmaneuver enemies who, for all their physical superiority, lack the tactical intelligence to coordinate their movements through the complex interior. The bell tower sequence, in particular, uses vertical space to create a sense of precarious elevation that adds a dimension of vertiginous danger to the combat, characters fighting not only each other but gravity itself as they navigate crumbling stonework and rotting timber at ever-increasing heights. The fire that spreads through the church during this sequence, initially a tactical problem and eventually an apocalyptic spectacle, consumes the evidence of Nazi atrocity even as it threatens to consume the protagonists, a purifying flame that makes no distinctions between the innocent and the guilty. The film's engagement with the iconography of the swastika is necessarily extensive given its setting, but it handles this loaded symbol with a restraint that avoids the trap of aestheticizing the emblem of genocide, presenting it as a ubiquitous feature of the occupied landscape rather than an object of fetishistic fascination. The flags that hang in the church, the armbands on the soldiers, the stamp on the identity papers, all these manifestations of the hooked cross are presented with the blunt matter-of-factness of historical reality, their horror residing not in their presentation, but in their implications, their reminder of the ideology that has transformed this quiet village into a charnel house. The film trusts its audience to understand what the swastika means without needing to underline it with dramatic emphasis, a confidence in the audience's historical literacy that is increasingly rare in contemporary cinema. The moment when the church's swastika banners catch fire and burn is handled without triumphalism, a simple visual fact that requires no editorializing. The film's score, composed by Jed Kurzel, deserves particular attention for its strategic restraint, its willingness to leave long stretches of the film unscored, allowing the diegetic sounds of warfare and horror to carry the emotional weight without musical underlining. When the score does assert itself, it does so with a blend of orchestral and electronic elements that bridge the historical setting and the contemporary horror sensibility. Strings distorted through processing that gives them an uncanny metallic edge, percussion that sounds less like drums than like industrial machinery operating in some vast and menacing factory. The main theme, when it finally emerges in full during the climactic sequence, carries a quality of tragic heroism rather than triumphalist bombast, a musical acknowledgement that victory in this context means survival rather than celebration, the achievement of having endured rather than having conquered. The film's relationship to the tradition of the zombie genre is both reverent and revisionist, honoring the conventions established by Romero and his successors while adapting them to the specific historical and thematic context of World War II. The reanimated soldiers are not the slow, shuffling corpses of classic zombie cinema, but fast, aggressive, and possessed of a rudimentary tactical intelligence that makes them more formidable antagonists, their military training somehow persisting in their muscles, if not in their minds. The film's explanation for their condition, the scientific rather than supernatural origin of their reanimation, aligns it with the tradition of the viral zombie rather than the magical zombie, rationalist approach to the irrational that reflects the technocratic nature of the Nazi evil it depicts. The headshot rule, that central dogma of zombie lore, is both observed and complicated, the reanimated soldiers requiring not just destruction of the brain, but catastrophic damage to the entire body before they finally cease their relentless advance. The film's treatment of faith and its loss is embodied most poignantly not in any single character, but in the church itself, a structure built to house the divine presence that has been hollowed out and filled with the profane, its sacred function perverted into a command center for atrocity. The crucifix that hangs above the altar, Christ's suffering body looking down upon the suffering bodies on the operating tables below, creates a visual parallel that the film allows to stand without comment, the comparison between sacrificial death and murderous experimentation generating a tension that the film refuses to resolve. The priest who presumably once served this congregation is absent, his fate unknown, his absence a silence that speaks to the broader destruction of spiritual authority under the occupation, the church's institution having failed to protect its flock from the wolves. The American soldiers, products of a culture that is nominally Christian but practically secular, move through this desecrated sacred space without the vocabulary to articulate what has been lost, sensing the violation without being able to name it. The film's understanding of masculinity is, by the standards of the war film genre, relatively nuanced, allowing its male characters to display fear, vulnerability, and moral uncertainty without framing these qualities as failures of manhood. Boyce's refusal to kill the mouse in the film's early scenes is presented not as cowardice, but as a kind of stubborn humanity, a refusal to accept the premise that war requires the complete suppression of empathy, and his eventual capacity for violence is framed as a tragic necessity rather than a triumphant maturation. Ford's hardness is presented as a wound rather than an achievement, a personality shaped by trauma into an instrument of extraordinary effectiveness at the cost of everything else that a human being might be or feel. The film suggests, without quite stating, that the war is producing a generation of men who will return home with parts of themselves permanently missing, amputated not by shrapnel, but by the relentless pressure of circumstances that demanded the suppression of everything soft in the name of survival. The film's representation of evil operates on multiple registers simultaneously, from the geopolitical evil of the Nazi regime to the institutional evil of the SS to the interpersonal evil of Waffner's predatory sexuality, creating a nested structure of malevolence that extends from the global to the intimate. This layered approach prevents the film from reducing evil to a single monstrous figure who can be defeated and thereby dispelled, acknowledging instead that the destruction of one monster, however cathartic, leaves the larger structures of evil largely intact. The serum, as a metaphor for this distributed evil, suggests that malevolence is not localized in particular individuals but diffused through systems, institutions, and ideologies, a pollutant that can contaminate anyone who comes into contact with it regardless of their initial moral orientation. The film's pessimism on this point is bracing. Its refusal to offer the comfort of a world cleansed of evil by the destruction of a single laboratory. The film's visual effects, blending practical prosthetics with digital augmentation, represent a particularly successful example of the hybrid approach that contemporary horror cinema has developed in response to audience fatigue with purely computer-generated imagery. The reanimated soldiers have the weight and presence that only physical effects can provide, their damaged bodies occupying real space and interacting with real light in ways that digital creations, however meticulously rendered, struggle to replicate. The digital augmentations, when they appear, are used to achieve effects that practical techniques cannot accomplish, such as the impossible movements of Waffner's shattered limbs or the internal glow of the serum visible through translucent flesh, and they are integrated so seamlessly with the practical elements that the audience cannot easily distinguish where one technique ends and the other begins. This technical fluency in the service of horror is a reminder that the best special effects are those that disappear into the reality of the image, that achieve their impact without drawing attention to their own cleverness. The film's understanding of space and confinement, its manipulation of claustrophobia and agoraphobia in alternation, structures the audience's physical experience of the narrative, moving us from the vast openness of the sky to the cramped interior of the aircraft to the exposed fields to the suffocating catacombs in a rhythm that never allows the nervous system to settle. The catacomb sequences, in particular, exploit the primal human fear of being underground, of being buried alive, of being trapped in spaces too narrow to turn around while something unseen moves toward you in the darkness. The film's sound design in these sequences shifts into a register of almost unbearable intimacy, every breath and heartbeat amplified, every drip of water and scuttle of unseen creatures registering with startling clarity in the confined acoustic space. The release from these underground sequences, the return to the relatively open spaces of the church above, produces a physical sensation of relief that the film immediately complicates by filling those open spaces with new threats, refusing to allow the audience any stable ground of safety. The film's dialogue, written by Billy Ray and Mark L. Smith, achieves the difficult balance between period authenticity and contemporary accessibility, avoiding both the stilted formality of bad historical fiction and the anachronistic colloquialism that would shatter the period illusion. The soldiers speak in the idiom of 1940s America, their slang and rhythms drawn from the letters and oral histories of the men who actually fought, but their speech is never so period-specific that it becomes a distraction, a museum piece that the audience must struggle to decipher. The German characters, when they speak English, do so with an accent that conveys foreignness without caricature, and their German-language exchanges are rendered with sufficient clarity that even audience members with no knowledge of the language can glean the essential meaning from context and tone. The French characters occupy a middle ground, their English marked by an accent that signals their nationality, while their occasional lapses into French communicate the emotional states that their second language English cannot fully express. The film's treatment of the D-Day invasion as an off-screen event, a distant rumble of artillery and a far-off glow on the horizon that never quite arrives until the final frames, is a bold structural choice that keeps the focus on the small-scale horror of the village, rather than allowing it to be swallowed by the larger historical spectacle. This narrative discipline, the refusal to cut away to the beaches of Normandy to show the invasion that every audience member knows is happening simultaneously, maintains the claustrophobic intensity of the character's experience. Their ignorance of the larger operation, mirroring the historical reality of soldiers who often had no idea how the battle was progressing beyond their immediate field of vision. The naval bombardment that provides the film's closing soundscape is heard rather than seen, a distant thunder that promises the arrival of reinforcement and the beginning of the end, but the film ends before that promise is fulfilled, leaving the characters in a liminal space between their ordeal and the larger liberation that is just beginning. The film's engagement with the ethics of experimentation, the use of human subjects without consent in the pursuit of knowledge or power, reaches beyond its immediate historical context to address enduring questions in medical ethics that remain urgent in the present day. The Nazi experiments, while historically specific in their brutality and their racist rationale, represent an extreme case of a temptation that is not unique to any particular ideology. The temptation to sacrifice the few for the benefit of the many, to treat human beings as means rather than ends in the pursuit of some greater good. The film's horror at the laboratory scenes derives not only from their graphic violence, but from their representation of a worldview in which human dignity has been entirely eliminated from the calculus of decision-making, in which people have been reduced to the status of laboratory animals, their suffering a matter of indifference to the men in white coats who observe and record. This ethical horror, more than the physical horror of the reanimated corpses, is what gives the film its enduring moral seriousness beneath its grindhouse surface. The film's final image of Boyce and Chloe sitting in the rubble as the dawn breaks and the guns rumble in the distance is a composition of profound weariness that resists the temptation to end on a note of triumphant uplift, offering instead the quieter satisfactions of survival and solidarity. Their faces, exhausted and blank, communicate the truth that victory in war does not feel like victory in the moment, that the immediate experience of having survived an ordeal is not elation, but a hollowed-out numbness that will take years to fill with anything resembling normal human emotion. The rubble around them, the shattered stones of the church that once dominated the village skyline, speaks to the destruction that liberation entails, the fact that even a just war leaves behind it a landscape of ruin that will take generations to rebuild. The film's willingness to end on this note of ambiguity, this refusal to provide the emotional closure that audiences have been conditioned to expect, is perhaps its most significant departure from the conventions of both the war film and the horror film. A gesture of respect for the complexity of the historical experience it has, however fantastically, attempted to evoke. The film's opening frames, before a single paratrooper has jumped or a single shot has been fired, establish a visual rhetoric of imminent catastrophe through the trembling rivets of the C-47's fuselage, each vibration telegraphing the anti-aircraft fire that awaits beyond the clouds, transforming the aircraft from a vehicle of deliverance into a metal coffin suspended in the crosshairs of history. The faces of the paratroopers, illuminated by the dim red cabin lights that serve both narrative function and symbolic weight, appear as a gallery of apprehension, each man processing his terror through the specific filter of his personality, some praying, some joking with forced bravado, some retreating into a silence that speaks louder than any scream. The blackened faces of the soldiers, smeared with burnt cork to prevent moonlight from reflecting off pale skin, transform these ordinary American boys into something already halfway toward the monstrous, a visual premonition of the transformations that the narrative will visit upon both body and soul before the night is through. The jump master's voice, barking commands over the roar of engines and the percussion of flak, becomes a lifeline of authority in a universe that is rapidly dissolving into chaos, the last tether connecting these men to the ordered world of military discipline before they are cast into the void. The moment when the green light illuminates and the first man hurls himself into the darkness is shot with a paradoxical stillness, a frozen instant of decision that separates the world of the aircraft from the world of the fall, a threshold crossed in a heartbeat that cannot be uncrossed. The geography of the drop zone, scattered across miles of occupied countryside by pilot error and anti-aircraft evasion, transforms the squad's assembly into a narrative of fragments gradually cohering, each survivor's journey through the night representing a miniature odyssey of terror and luck. The film's depiction of these solitary journeys, brief but evocative, sketches a landscape of disorientation where familiar landmarks have been rendered alien by darkness and fear, where every hedgerow might conceal an enemy patrol and every farmhouse might harbor either sanctuary or betrayal. The sound of the German patrols, their guttural exchanges carried on the night air, precedes their visual appearance, an acoustic signature of threat that keeps both characters and audience in a state of perpetual auditory vigilance, straining to parse the darkness for signs of approaching danger. The regrouping of the squad, accomplished through a series of near misses and fortunate encounters, establishes the network of relationships that will sustain the narrative, each soldier's survival a relief that the film allows its audience to feel before it begins killing them off with methodical brutality. The discovery of the dead paratrooper hanging from a tree, his parachute tangled in the branches and his body riddled with bullets, provides a stark visual premonition of the fate that awaits any of them who falter, a corpse that serves as both warning and memorial. The film's treatment of silence as a tactical resource and a psychological state deserves extended consideration. The characters moving through an occupied landscape where the slightest sound, a snapped twig or a whispered word, can summon destruction from the darkness. The sequences of stealth, the squad picking their way through the village streets while patrols pass within arm's reach, generate tension through the suppression of sound, the audience holding its breath in sympathetic silence with the characters, a participatory quiet that makes the eventual explosions all the more jarring by contrast. The silences between characters, the things left unsaid in the interest of maintaining morale or avoiding conflict, accumulate throughout the film like unplayed notes in a musical composition, their absence shaping the emotional texture of the relationships as much as any dialogue. The silence of the dead, both the enemy dead and the fallen comrades, becomes a reproach and a question, a void where personality and possibility used to reside, and the film allows this silence to linger rather than rushing to fill it with the noise of the next action sequence. The final silence of the film, the exhausted quiet of Boyce and Chloe in the rubble, is the silence not of peace but of aftermath, a cessation of violence that is not yet the beginning of healing. The film's color grading during the laboratory sequences shifts into a register of sickly fluorescence that drains all warmth from the image, the overhead surgical lights casting a spectrum that makes healthy skin look corpse-like and fresh blood look black, a visual distortion that mirrors the moral distortion of the experiments being conducted beneath their glare. This lighting choice, common in horror cinema but deployed here with particular precision, creates a visual environment in which the normal cues by which we assess health and humanity are systematically subverted, where the living look dead and the dead move with a parody of life. The contrast between this clinical illumination and the warm, amber glow of Chloe's kitchen, the only space in the film lit by firelight and candles, establishes a chromatic binary between the human and the inhuman, the domestic and the institutional, the space of care and the space of experimentation. The gradual invasion of the warm spaces by the cold light, as the action moves inexorably toward the laboratory and its horrors, traces a visual arc of desecration, the human world retreating before the advance of the clinical. The final conflagration, the explosion that consumes both laboratory and church, restores a different quality of light, the orange and red of fire that is destructive but also purifying, a light that consumes rather than exposes. The film's representation of the chain of command, the military hierarchy that structures the relationships among the American soldiers, provides a framework for exploring questions of authority, obedience, and moral responsibility that resonate beyond the immediate context of the mission. Ford's authority as corporal is absolute within the small unit, his decisions binding on men who have been trained to obey orders, even when those orders conflict with their personal moral instincts, a tension that the film exploits to generate dramatic conflict between Ford and Boyce. The absence of higher-ranking officers, killed in the drop or scattered across the countryside, isolates the squad in a command vacuum where Ford's word is effectively law, there being no lieutenant or captain to whom his decisions might be appealed. This isolation of authority is a classic war film trope. The small unit cut off from higher command and forced to make life-and-death decisions without the guidance of doctrine or the reassurance of accountability. But Overlord invests it with particular horror movie resonance. The authority figure's decisions now carrying stakes that include not just tactical success or failure, but the potential unleashing of a biological apocalypse. Ford's eventual death, the passing of authority to Boyce by default rather than by formal transfer, represents a generational shift in the film's moral universe, the old rules of pragmatic ruthlessness giving way to a new calculus in which the protection of the innocent has become the overriding objective. The film's handling of the friendship between Boyce and Tibbet, sketched in a few brief exchanges before Tibbet's brutal death, provides the emotional stakes that make the subsequent action meaningful. The audience's investment in Boyce's survival intensified by the loss of the character we have seen him care about. Their banter, the easy camaraderie of soldiers who have trained together and now face death together, establishes a baseline of normal human connection against which the film's horrors can be measured, the warmth of their friendship making the coldness of the laboratory all the more appalling by contrast. Tibbet's function as the squad's photographer, his camera a tool of documentation and memory, adds a layer of metacinematic commentary to his character. The man who records images ultimately becoming an image himself, a body among bodies, his camera presumably shattered alongside his skull. The photographs he might have taken, the record of the squad's ordeal that will never be developed, represent a lost archive, a counter-history that the official record will never include, and the film itself becomes a kind of substitute for this missing documentation, a visual testament to events that the world will never know occurred. The film's engagement with the concept of the home front, the world for which the soldiers are fighting and to which they hope to return, is necessarily indirect given the setting, but it manifests in the small objects and memories that the characters carry with them, the photographs and letters and talismans that connect them to lives left behind. These objects, glimpsed briefly in moments of quiet, serve as anchors of identity in a situation that is systematically stripping away everything that makes the soldiers individuals rather than interchangeable units of military force. The German soldiers, by contrast, are largely denied this dimension of characterization, presented without the personal effects that would humanize them, a narrative choice that maintains the moral clarity of the conflict while sacrificing the complexity that a more even-handed treatment might have achieved. The exception is Waffner, whose personal vanity and sexual appetite provide him with a kind of individuality that the faceless German patrols lack, a specificity of evil that makes him a more satisfying antagonist than the anonymous hordes. The film's sound mixing during the battle sequences employs a dynamic range that alternates between overwhelming volume and sudden near silence, simulating the auditory experience of combat where explosions can temporarily deafen, reducing the world to a high-pitched ringing and the muffled thump of one's own heartbeat. This technique, borrowed from the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan, but applied with fresh variation, puts the audience inside the physiological experience of the characters, their temporary deafness becoming our temporary deafness, their disorientation our disorientation. The return of sound, the gradual reemergence of gunfire and shouting and the squelch of boots in mud, is experienced as a relief and a renewed assault simultaneously, the world flooding back in with all its terror intact. The film's understanding that hearing is as vulnerable as flesh, that the ears can be wounded as surely as the body, adds another dimension to its comprehensive depiction of human fragility in the face of industrialized violence. The film's treatment of the French resistance, embodied primarily in Chloe but suggested in the network of villagers who have sheltered her and her brother, pays tribute to the historical reality of civilian resistance movements that operated in the shadows of occupation, gathering intelligence, sheltering downed airmen, and awaiting the moment when open rebellion would become possible. Chloe's isolation, her lack of visible connection to a larger resistance network, is a plot necessity that also reflects the atomization of resistance under occupation, the need for cells to operate independently to minimize the damage of infiltration and betrayal. Her armory, the collection of weapons hidden beneath the floorboards of her home, represents the latent power of the occupied population, the potential for violence that simmers beneath the surface of compliance, waiting for the signal that will transform hidden capacity into open action. The film's depiction of her eventual armed participation in the battle is thus not a departure from her established character, but the fulfillment of a trajectory that has been implied from her first appearance, the secret warrior finally stepping into the light. The film's narrative economy, its refusal to indulge in subplots or tangents that would dilute the central tension, creates a momentum that carries the audience through the preposterous premise on sheer forward thrust, the velocity of the storytelling leaving no time for the skepticism that a more leisurely pace might invite. Every scene advances either the mission or the horror, and often both simultaneously, the dual engines of the plot working in tandem to compress the running time into an experience that feels shorter than its actual duration, a rare achievement in an era of bloated blockbusters. The editing rhythm, quick but legible, respects the audience's capacity to follow action without resorting to the rapid-fire cutting that reduces many contemporary action sequences to incomprehensible blurs of motion and color. The spatial coherence maintained throughout the film, the audience always aware of where characters are in relation to each other and to their objectives, is a testament to the clarity of the filmmaking, a discipline that serves both the war movie realism and the horror movie suspense. The film's engagement with the tradition of the mad scientist narrative, stretching back through Gothic literature to the founding myth of Frankenstein, positions the Nazi doctor as the latest in a long line of overreachers who have sought to transcend human limitation through scientific means and have produced only monsters. The laboratory beneath the church is a direct descendant of Victor Frankenstein's attic workshop, the charnel house transformed into a place of creation, the surgeon playing God with parts harvested from the dead and the living alike. The difference, and it is a crucial one, is that the Nazi doctor's project is not individual but institutional, not a solitary obsession but a state-sponsored program, his madness sanctioned and funded by the apparatus of a modern nation-state. This scaling up of the mad scientist archetype, from the eccentric individual to the functionary of a regime, reflects the historical reality of Nazi science, which was not the work of isolated lunatics, but of credentialed professionals operating within a system that had systematically eliminated the ethical constraints that would have restrained them in a healthy society. The film's representation of the reanimated as beings trapped between states, neither alive nor dead, neither human nor animal, neither conscious nor entirely mindless, locates them in a category of ontological horror that disturbs precisely because it refuses easy classification. The traditional monster, the vampire or werewolf or ghost, occupies a defined place in the taxonomy of the supernatural. Its nature understood even if its existence is feared, but the reanimated soldiers of Overlord are something new, something that the characters have no cultural framework for understanding, no folklore to consult, no established method of disposal. This novelty of the threat, the absence of a traditional name for what they are facing, adds to the disorientation of both characters and audience, forcing them to learn the rules of engagement through lethal trial and error. The film's refusal to provide a satisfying scientific explanation for the serum's mechanism, its origin left deliberately obscure, maintains this sense of the unknown. The suspicion that what is happening in the laboratory is not science in any meaningful sense, but something older and darker wearing the borrowed robes of scientific authority. The film's climactic destruction of the church, the steeple toppling in a cascade of stone and flame, draws on a rich cinematic tradition of collapsing religious architecture as a signifier of cosmic disorder, from the falling crucifix of The Exorcist to the engulfed cathedral of the beyond. The steeple's fall is rendered with a combination of practical and digital effects that gives it genuine weight, the stones tumbling with the slow inevitability of catastrophe, crushing everything in their path with an impartiality that makes no distinction between Nazi and American, monster and man. The symbolic resonance of this destruction, the house of God brought low by the evil it has been forced to shelter, is left for the audience to interpret, the film declining to editorialize on the theological implications of the image it has so carefully constructed. The smoke that rises from the ruins, visible against the dawn sky, is a pillar of witness, a signal that something terrible has happened here, something that will be explained away in official reports, but that the survivors will carry with them for the rest of their lives. The film's treatment of the serum as a substance that both preserves and corrupts, that grants a kind of immortality at the cost of everything that makes existence meaningful, engages with ancient anxieties about the elixir of life, the fountain of youth, the bargain with dark forces that promises eternal existence while delivering only eternal suffering. The reanimated soldiers are immortal in the most limited and horrifying sense, their bodies continuing to function after the destruction of organs that should be essential to life, their consciousness either extinguished or trapped in a prison of malfunctioning flesh from which death would be a release. This perversion of the dream of immortality, the granting of the wish in a form that reveals the wish itself as a curse, is a classic horror trope that the film handles with fresh conviction. The spectacle of Waffner's ruined body, refusing to die, serving as a cautionary tableau for anyone who would trade humanity for power. The film's implicit argument is that mortality is not a bug in the human system but a feature, that the acceptance of death is a condition of meaningful life, and that the attempt to escape this condition leads only to a state that is neither life nor death, but a ghastly simulation of both. The film's representation of the American military as a flawed but fundamentally decent institution, capable of producing both the ruthless efficiency of Ford and the stubborn compassion of Boyce, reflects a particular moment in American cinema's relationship with its armed forces, a post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan perspective that allows for complexity without descending into cynicism or facile anti-war messaging. The soldiers are not heroes by nature but by circumstance, ordinary men thrust into extraordinary situations and responding with whatever mixture of courage and fear their particular personalities provide. The film does not interrogate the larger political context of the war, accepting the standard narrative of the good war as a given rather than a subject for examination, a choice that allows it to focus on the immediate experience of combat without the distraction of geopolitical debate. This acceptance of the conventional moral framework of World War II is, depending on one's perspective, either a refreshing clarity or a missed opportunity. But it is consistent with the film's identity as a genre exercise rather than a historical meditation. The film's visual quotation of iconic war photography, the compositions that echo Robert Capa's blurred D-Day images, or the flag raisings and beach landings that have been burned into cultural memory, situates the film within a visual tradition that predates and exceeds it, borrowing authenticity from the documentary record while embellishing that record with the fantastic. These quotations are not parasitism but homage, a recognition that the film's images, however skillfully constructed, cannot compete with the reality of the historical photographs, can only gesture toward them with the respect due to primary sources. The film's cinematographer, Laurie Rose, has spoken in interviews about studying period photography to capture the quality of light and the grain structure of 1940s imagery, a research process that manifests in the film's texture, its evocation of a visual era before high-definition video and digital clarity. The result is a film that looks like a memory of World War II rather than a reconstruction, a dream of the 1940s filtered through the visual vocabulary of the 2010s. The film's depiction of Paul, Chloe's young brother, as the vulnerable innocent whose safety justifies the risks the characters take, taps into a deep vein of narrative tradition in which the child represents the future, the reason for fighting, the proof that the struggle is not merely about survival, but about the preservation of a world worth surviving for. Paul's silent presence, his wide-eyed witness to horrors that no child should see, functions as a moral compass more reliable than any abstract principle, his vulnerability a constant reminder of what is at stake beyond the tactical objectives of the mission. The threat to Paul, the Nazi willingness to experiment on children, is the point at which the film's evil becomes absolute, crossing a line that even the most hardened audience member recognizes as the boundary beyond which no redemption is possible. His survival, the film's one unequivocal mercy, is the reward for the suffering the audience has endured, the single life saved that justifies, in the film's moral calculus, the carnage that has been required to save it. The film's marketing campaign, which initially obscured the horror elements in favor of a straight war movie presentation, replicated on a commercial scale the bait-and-switch that the narrative itself performs on its characters, selling audiences a World War II paratrooper drama and delivering them into a nightmare of mad science and reanimated corpses. This marketing strategy, controversial among some viewers who felt misled, was arguably the most honest possible approach to a film whose pleasure depends on the surprise of genre transformation, the sudden swerve from historical realism to pulp horror that constitutes the film's essential cinematic gesture. The audiences who came expecting Saving Private Ryan and got something closer to Reanimator by way of Band of Brothers were experiencing, in the safety of the theater, a version of the disorientation that the characters experience in the narrative, the sudden discovery that the world is not what they thought it was, and that the rules they were trained to follow no longer apply. The film's place in the larger trajectory of Julius Avery's career, as a director moving from the gritty Australian crime drama Son of a Gun to the big-budget genre hybrid of Overlord, demonstrates a versatility and a command of tone that bodes well for his continued development. His ability to honor genre conventions while infusing them with sufficient human detail to elevate the enterprise beyond mere pastiche. His direction of actors, eliciting performances that ground the fantastic in the recognizable, is the film's secret weapon, the reason that the audience remains invested in the characters even as the plot spirals into ever more outrageous territory. His collaboration with cinematographer Laurie Rose, a veteran of Ben Wheatley's similarly genre-defying work, produces a visual texture that is both gritty and painterly, grounded in location and elevated by composition. A look that serves the dual demands of the war film and the horror film without shortchanging either. His pacing, the sense of a director who knows exactly when to accelerate and when to pause for breath, suggests an intuitive understanding of audience psychology. A filmmaker who trusts his material enough to let it breathe and confident enough to tighten the screws when the moment demands. The film's debt to the video game aesthetic, particularly the Call of Duty franchise's zombie modes, is both a limitation and a strength, providing a familiar grammar of action that younger audiences will recognize while potentially dating the film for future viewers who may not share the cultural references that inform its design. The sequences of characters moving through the laboratory, clearing rooms and dispatching enemies with headshots, replicate the rhythm of first-person shooter gameplay with a fidelity that is clearly intentional, a translation of interactive experience into cinematic spectacle. The film's relationship to gaming is not merely imitative but dialogic, taking the tropes that games have borrowed from war movies and horror movies and re-importing them into cinema with the pacing and visual language that gaming has contributed to the broader media ecology. This circulation of influence, from film to game to film again, is characteristic of contemporary popular culture, and Overlord navigates this feedback loop with more grace than most attempts at video game-adjacent cinema. The film's handling of the French setting, the specificity of the Norman village with its stone architecture and its particular quality of rural isolation, respects the geographical reality of the D-Day invasion while transforming that reality into a stage for fantasy, a balance that European audiences, particularly French audiences, have not always found persuasive. The criticism from French reviewers, who objected to the film's use of their national trauma as a backdrop for entertainment, raises legitimate questions about the ethics of historical fiction, the responsibilities of filmmakers who appropriate real suffering for the purposes of genre pleasure. The film's defenders might argue that the horror genre has always processed historical trauma through the lens of the fantastic, that the zombies of George Romero are inseparable from the American anxieties about race and consumerism that produced them, and that Overlord's Nazi monsters are a legitimate symbolic processing of the very real horror that the historical Nazis represented. This debate, which the film does not resolve and perhaps cannot resolve, is part of what makes it a more interesting object of analysis than a simple B-movie might initially appear to be. The film's sound design during the reanimation sequences deserves further analysis for its layering of organic and mechanical sounds, the wet tear of tissue accompanied by what sounds like the grinding of gears, as if the reanimated body were not merely biology gone wrong, but biology transformed into mechanism, the human reduced to a machine that runs on the black fuel of the serum. This mechanical quality of the reanimation soundscape connects the supernatural horror to the industrial horror of the war, the factories and tanks and bombers that represent the mechanization of death on a global scale, the individual body becoming a microcosm of the larger machinery of destruction. The sound of bones resetting themselves, a noise that the film returns to repeatedly, is particularly effective because it triggers a visceral empathetic response, the audience's own skeletons aching in sympathy with the impossible contortions they are witnessing. The sound team's decision to emphasize these organic mechanical sounds over the more traditional zombie moans represents a creative choice that distinguishes Overlord's monsters from the countless undead that have shambled across screens in the decades since Romero first defined the type. The film's exploration of loyalty, the bonds that hold the squad together in the face of increasingly impossible circumstances, provides the emotional infrastructure that supports the spectacular action. The audience's investment in the character's survival depending on the conviction that these relationships are worth preserving. Ford's loyalty to his men, expressed not in words but in actions, in his refusal to leave anyone behind and his willingness to sacrifice himself when the moment demands, complicates his earlier ruthlessness, revealing a core of principle beneath the pragmatic exterior. The squad's loyalty to each other, tested by the discovery of the laboratory and the horror that it represents, holds firm not because of abstract patriotism, but because of the concrete, personal bonds that have been forged in training and tempered in combat. The film's argument, implicit in the survival of the characters who maintain these bonds and the death of those who isolate themselves, is that human connection is not a weakness in the face of horror, but the only reliable defense against it. The film's final moments, before the credits roll, offer no epilogue, No text crawl explaining what happened to the survivors after the war. No comforting return to normalcy that would domesticate the horror that has been depicted. This refusal of closure, the commitment to ending in the immediate aftermath of the climax rather than in the safety of a later time when the wounds have healed and the nightmares have faded, respects the experience of the characters and the audience alike, acknowledging that some experiences do not resolve into neat narratives, that some horrors persist beyond the frame of the story. The roar of the approaching Allied forces, the promise of rescue and reinforcement, is heard but not seen, a future that the film gestures toward but does not depict, leaving the characters suspended in the moment between ordeal and deliverance, the moment that, for many veterans of the real war, stretched into years and decades and lifetimes.